Lesson 3 of Christian ethics, walking the Christian life or living the Christian life. But we'll do Christian ethics. We're going to discuss quite a bit of ethical background considerations today and what to do about ethics as Christians. So that hence the term Christian ethics. So we'll work on that. So today's trivia question is, though, what was the name of the father-in-law of Moses? I alluded to it last week. I figure we might as well ask it this week since you've been studying. Was the name of the father-in-law of Moses? And it's in scripture. Well, Jethro is an excellent answer, and I will accept that answer by not asking you to leave. But it's, yeah. So I think that's nice. But Jethro actually, interestingly, was almost certainly his title as the priest of Midian. Jethro means something like His Excellency. In fact, I could probably, yeah, it does. It means His Excellency. So his name was actually Jethro somebody, His Excellency, the priest of Midian, His Excellency, the priest of Midian. So he was Jethro, the priest of Midian, but he had a name also, a first name, last name, middle name, whatever name. Yes, it was Reuel. So very good. So let's look at Exodus 2. It was, let's look at verse 15. When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. This was after Moses killed the Egyptian who beat the Hebrew. Come in. Oh man, now I gotta try to compete with sermons, except it's over. So that's good. But let's look at Exodus 2:15. When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now, a priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came through to draw water and filled the troughs and watered their father's flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away. But Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked them, "Why have you returned so early a day?" They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." So that was Reuel, who then later, like chapter 3, verse 1, Moses was sending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. That was the title, His Excellency, the priest of Midian. But his name was Reuel. So always found Reuel to be a hard word to say as opposed to non-urban. So I call him non-urban when I have a chance. All right, so the Joshua 2. Let's land there for a minute with a couple of things on Christian ethics. So as we talk about Christian ethics, we want to talk about a few examples of dilemmas in church and in society for Christians. And I want to emphasize, much like we talked about the midwives of Egypt last time, they did not exert any form of Christian ethic because Christianity wasn't around. But there are ethics. These are Old Testament ethics. So let's look at Joshua 2. And here's another little zinger for us on names, much like Reuel and Jethro. But when Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim to look over the land, he said, especially Jericho. So he said, look over the land, especially Jericho. So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. Does anybody have a little footnote on the prostitute Rahab? That would be in your Bible if you have one. And so just a thought. But anyway, mine has a little footnote. What, you got one back there? Oh, okay. That's all right. That was a near miss for sure. But mine has a little footnote and says possibly means an innkeeper instead of prostitute. Doesn't that change the story quite a bit? You know, I mean, it's kind of interesting, possibly just an innkeeper. But, you know, over in James chapter 2, I believe it is, James referred to, you know, don't you remember that Rahab the prostitute helped? And, you know, so I think it's probably a fair thing. But anyway, that's a little different view. She was an innkeeper. But then verse 2, the king of Jericho told, look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land. So the king of Jericho sends message to Rahab, bring out the men who came to you and entered your house because they have come to spy on the whole land. So I want to emphasize a couple of things here from an ethical standpoint. One is that it was known that there had been spies who were sent by the people of God, by the Israelites, into Jericho, and it was known that Rahab had this association, whether an innkeeper or a prostitute. She was known to have them at her house. Okay, so bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out the whole land. But the woman had taken the two men and hidden them. She said, yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they had come from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, the men left. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly. You may catch up with them. But verse 6, she had taken them up on the roof and hidden them under stalks of flax she had laid on the roof. So men set out and pursued the spies on the road that leads to the fords of the Jordan. And as soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut before the spies lay down for the night. She went up on the roof. She said to them, I know that the Lord has given this land to you, and that great fear has fallen on us. So all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We've heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard it, our hearts melted and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you'll show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you'll spare the lives of my father, mother, and brothers, sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you'll save us from death. Our lives for your lives, the men assured her. If you don't tell what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us land. So she let them down by the rope in the window, for the house she lived in is part of the city walls. She said to him, go to the hills, so the pursuers will not find you. Hide yourselves there for 3 days until they return, then go on your way. The men said to her, this oath you made us swear will not be binding on us, unless when we enter the land, you have tied this scarlet cord through the window, through which you let us down, and unless you have brought your father, mother, brothers, all your family in your house. If anyone goes outside your house into the street, his blood will be on his own head. We will not be responsible. As for anyone who is in the house with you, his blood will be on our head if a hand is laid on him. But if you tell us what we are doing, we will be released from the oath that you may swear. Agreed, she said. Let it be as you say. So she sent them away and departed, and she tied the scarlet cord in the window. When they left, they went out into the hills, stayed there 3 days. So the pursuers had searched all on the road and returned without finding them. The two men started back. They went down out of the hills, forded the river, came to Joshua, son of Nun, told him everything that happened. So they said to Joshua, the Lord has surely given the whole land into our hands. All the people are melting in fear because of us, which is also kind of an interesting little piece of the information. But what I wanted to emphasize was where the ethics came in. So Rahab knew, the king knew that Rahab had association with spies, that they had been at the house, and she flat out said here, the men came to me, verse 4, but I did not know where they'd come from. Well, I think she knew that. And then at dusk, when it's time to close the city gate, the men left. I think she knew they didn't. And then when she said, go after him quickly, you may catch up, but she had taken up to the roof and hidden them under stalks of flax that she laid down on the roof. So while acknowledging that God was in charge, that God, the God of heaven and the God of earth, was in charge and had surely delivered the land, she also lied in 3 ways to the king of Jericho. So from an ethical standpoint, was that the right thing to do? Could God have delivered the city to them without that? Yeah, absolutely. Was Rahab at guilt for having lied to a pagan king? Is it okay to lie to a pagan king? Is it okay to lie to the king, pagan or not? I think those are things that are of interest for us to think about as we talk about submission to authorities. And so, obviously we know the outcome of the story. In fact, we even know that Rahab had part in the lineage of Jesus because of this deliverance. But I think it's interesting that she, flat out lied. Oh, I don't know who these guys are. And they left. And she intentionally hit them on the roof and told them how, I didn't even get into it, how she told them how to escape. She knew the guys would be out on the plane for 3 days, wait till they come back, then go, hide in the mountains because they won't be there. There were a number of layers of lies there. So let's talk a little bit about ethics and the background of ethics. So anybody willing to define ethics? What would you think when you think of being ethical? And it's not just the art of being ethical. That's an unfair definition. It's not even being ethically ethical in your ethical approach. Yes. Okay, right thing at the right time for the right reason. I think that's an excellent definition. So if we do the right thing at the right time for the right reason, that would have to be based on something that determines what that circumstance is, right? So here, the circumstance was that people from Israel had come into Jericho, were being searched out by a pagan king, would surely be probably killed, I'm guessing. I think that's probably what kings of Jericho did at the time. And then, they had heard about the mighty forces of God's people, the army and such, destroying other kings and other communities. So they're afraid. So I think that's reasonable. So they do the right thing at the right time for the right reason being that these were people sent by God, essentially, through Joshua. So I think that adds up very well, definition-wise. So if we look at the big picture of ethics, I think too, based on that definition, in fact, do the right thing at the right time for the right reason, that is based on who is in charge, right? So if you have ethics in America, we'll use that as an example since we have familiarity. If you do the right thing, it would depend on who's in charge at the time to determine the right thing, correct? That would be some degree of what we may call situational ethics, because it would depend on who's in charge at that time as to what the right thing is. So this time, the ethic in Jericho would be who's maybe in charge would be the king of Jericho, that he would determine what the ethics of the time were. So in other words, if you had two spies come in and you knew they were from a foreign attacking nation, it would be okay to kill them, right? Based on Jericho ethics at the time. When we look at yeah, great. If you can grab that chair there, that'd be perfect. If you look at, just plain and simply the ethic of Jericho, it would be protect the borders of Jericho at all costs, right? So that would mean that killing two spies would be reasonable. It probably mean killing the person who hid those spies if she was found out would be reasonable, as indeed Rahab said, would you please show mercy on me when you come to destroy the city, because otherwise my parents and my siblings and my family will all be killed. And the spies, in a, sort of almost like a shadowing from the time of the Exodus from Egypt, said, if you mark your doorway or your window properly and have the people there as they should be, we'll save them. But if they're outside of that, blood's on their head. So that all makes sense, I think. But that's two obverse or oppositional ethics coming together. That's the ethic of saving the land, the city, and the ethic of acknowledging that God is in charge. So, as we all nodded our heads earlier, God could have saved or led his people to conquer the land of Jericho easily, I believe, without having these spies survive this journey, right? And I suspect even the spies knew that if they really thought about it, they probably realized, hey, by going into Jericho, there's a pretty good chance we'll be killed. But it's because Joshua, our commander-in-chief, sent us, and maybe more importantly, our real commander-in-chief, God, sent us into that land. Okay, so let's look, keeping all that in mind about ethics, let's look back to Romans, where we were last week, Romans 13. I just want to point out too that, if we talk about the ethic from the standpoint of the Jerichoites and from the standpoint of the Israelites, it's going to be different. And that's where that doing the right thing at the right time for the right reason does fall into play, because it all depends on who is in charge of you. Yes.
Well, I'm looking at this and I'm looking at verse 11. It says, when we heard of it, our hearts melted and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on her ethics towards, at that time towards God, the God of heaven, or were her ethics at that time towards the king of Jericho? That is the way I look at this, is she was looking at God is the God of, is the real God, so his ethics are the one.
Excellent point. So what he's saying, for the sake of the taping again, is that based on chapter 2 of Joshua, verse 11, where she says that we had heard about what the God of heaven and the God of earth has done, that she was following the new calling. She was confessing belief in God, is essentially what you're saying, and following that new calling, the higher calling of God's will versus the will of man in her community. And indeed, that is what ethics then that's based on God all boils down to, is you do what God calls you to do, regardless of what the society would call you to do, if those are not in active opposition. Okay, so there are two differing viewpoints here, but well, that's a different phone deal. But if we, sorry to pick on you, but if we look at, from the ethical standpoint, if she could follow the king of Jericho all the way, that would presumably be the right thing to do. But when that will of the king of Jericho goes against the will of the king of the universe and God himself, that's a different situation. Now, again, I think God could have worked it out just fine. God is God. He could deliver Jericho to the Israelites just as he intended, whether those spies had made it out alive or not, and whether Rahab had confessed belief in God or not. Or maybe they could just run. Maybe they're super good runners and could run from the guys and just, taking care of their own lives without her. But when we look at the big picture of the will of God, and the fact that Rahab was mentioned several other times in scripture, it's an incredible faith move that she made to follow after God instead of the pagan situation in Jericho. Remember that Jericho was to be destroyed because they worship false gods. That was the whole issue of God said, go into the land of Israel, wipe out every community, do not let any survive, because I don't want you to fall into worship of false gods or into marriage with women who are serving false gods, or in any way to participate in the false gods of the land of Canaan. Canaan was to be swept clean, and the people were to be serving God only. So that was part of God's will, clearly, was to wipe out Jericho. I mean, there was every intention. That was what he had told Joshua would happen, and what they were to do as following his will. So, a more modern, I think, kind of an ethical dilemma would be that, well, let me back up for a second, then I'll mention that one. And that is that when we look at ethics, if we base ethics on God, which I hope all of us do, I think almost always it's a fairly straight answer as to how we respond to something in society, family, life, whatever that circumstance is. I don't think I have been directly asked to disobey God for a particular reason in my lifetime that came down to, you do this or we'll kill you, unless you choose, if you choose God. Or I haven't been put in a spot where I need to choose God or choose life, essentially, because I'm faced with, look, we're going to kill you if you don't renounce God or go against his will. I've never had that circumstance. I'm guessing most of us have never been in that circumstance. I've never, as far as I'm aware, been forced to make a decision like, do I follow the government rule or do I follow God's law in like hiding people who are coming to, spy out the land, see how God can take it over for us.
Many of our missionaries do all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So those things can happen. I just personally haven't been in that spot, but I do think it does happen. So a more modern day example, and this wasn't necessarily, as far as I know, based on Christian ethics, but would be like, for instance, the hiding of Anne Frank and her family during World War II. During the purging of the Jews by Hitler and the Nazi forces, at some point, a family decided they would hide Anne Frank and her family in their home. And, if you followed straight ethics of saying, well, because I follow ethical laws of God and God says don't lie, if those Nazi soldiers come by, I've got to say, hey, I've got a Jewish family hidden back behind my wall, and I'll show you where they are, because that would be, not lying to the soldier who maybe would say, is there anything about any Jewish people hiding here that we need to know? And for them to hide someone and save that life, I don't think any of us would disagree that that's ethically right. So that goes into that circumstance of doing the right thing for the right reason at the right time, or at the right time for the right reason, because I think saving that life would be an appropriate move on the basis of ethics at the time. Now, was that against the rules of the society? I would say yes. Have you ever been in a spot where you need to hide someone or they'd be killed by the government? I'm guessing no. But, again, that could happen at some point. There's a lot of terrorism in Burkina Faso, as you mentioned this morning. And, I know that that's a brutal realm that we don't hear about much unless you really seek out that information. But thankfully, we haven't been faced with that here yet. So, thinking about if you just look at ethics again, let me just mention a couple more things, and then we'll get back to the scripture there, Romans 13. One is that, a lot of our ethics are based on who's in charge, so that there are certain laws you follow based on the Congress or on the president or on a ruling by the Supreme Court that are allowable in our society, but maybe are not something you have to face directly. And so this gets in, what I would say in that case then is that you have sort of a government-based ethic that is, is guiding your life, that you may or may not like, but it may or may not be against the will of God. And I would say that most of the time in our society, I think that's probably not been against God's will in things that we've been asked for. Yes.
The interesting thing to me about this question is that it makes us think about, at least for me, makes me think about that I was raised with a very strict black and white view of right and wrong before God. And this makes me consider that the rules are not what God needs me to pay attention to, but the love that underlies them.
Great point.
So that when I'm making decisions where there seems to be a conflict, I need to consider love.
Yes, absolutely. So what she's saying is that she was raised in a circumstance where it was a very cut and dried right and wrong type of a rule set, but that realizing in ordinary life, there are a number of things that fall outside of that, that if we base them on a response of love, and God is love, that may change that black and white type of right and wrong behavioral approach. Is that a fair enough summary?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have to tell you, that's been a challenge for me. Having all those years of, you're not right with God if you don't keep the rule, to shift to thinking about you're right with God if you love like God.
Yeah, interesting. So it's shifting from the idea of just hard and fast rules of right and wrong, very potentially different, very directly different, from dealing with things from a standpoint of love, right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Very good. I want to make sure I paraphrase correctly so it doesn't only just fit what I want to say. But so I'm going to read Romans 13. Actually, having read Romans 13 last week, I'm going to let's refer us over to 1 Peter 2, because I think that addresses it pretty directly too. So 1 Peter 2, 1 Peter is right there before 2 Peter, if you have any trouble finding it. And so I'm going to look at this a little differently. Well, first, I'm going to mention here 1 Peter 2:13. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men, whether to the king as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. Live as free men, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as servants of God, show proper respect to everyone, love the brotherhood of believers, fear God, honor the king. I've always found it interesting that that phrase right there together, show proper respect to everyone. This is 1 Peter 2:17, if you're just getting there. Show proper respect to everyone, love the brotherhood of believers, fear God, honor the king. That's all together. That is a common phrase approach to what God's telling us through Peter there in his letter. So now we're going to look back to look at this a little differently. Let's look back a few verses and forward a few verses, because it's so easy to take a little section and make it, our discussion point or our commandment or whatever. I want to look at the context. So I'm going to look at chapter 2, verse 9 first. You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. So let's think about that verse for just a second. All these verses are very nationalistic feeling, right? Kind of a patriotism feeling, if you will. So we are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God. So was he talking to a literal nation? No, I don't think so. I think he was talking to the people of God being a nation of collective believers. Just as a reminder, Peter wrote this to God's elect, verse 1 of chapter 1, strangers in the world scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, who have been chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, through the sanctifying work of the Spirit for obedience to Jesus Christ. So this was a grouping of people from all over a region. So it wasn't a literal nation, but it is a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you're a people of God. So previously there was no relationship between them. Now they are saved people of God, saved through the same blood of Christ that can save all. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you, as aliens and strangers in the world, to abstain from sinful desires, which war against your soul. Once again, kind of almost a nationalistic type of speech there about war against the soul. Live such good lives among pagans that though they accuse you of doing the wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men, whether to the king as the supreme authority, or the governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good, you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. Live as free men, but do not use your freedom as a cover up for evil. Live as servants of God, show proper respect to everyone, love the brotherhood of believers, fear God, honor the king. Last week, we had a little short discussion about the comment that God doesn't intend for us to be suppressed. And I would address that at verse 18. Peter addressed that. Slaves, submit yourselves to your masters with all respect, not only those who are good and considerate, but also those who are harsh. For it is commendable if a man bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because he is conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on a tree, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds, you have been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. And to me, the next zinger, because, keep in mind that chapters and verses were put in by people so that we could find this and read it together, not by God. So there's not a break here. So it says, Peter says, you were like sheep going astray. Now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Wives, in the same way, be submissive to your husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives when they see the purity and reverence of your lives, And then verse 7, husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives. Treat them with respect as a weaker partner, and as heirs with you the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. Finally, verse 8, chapter 3, all of you live in harmony with one another. Be sympathetic, love as brothers, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult, but with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. So all of that, I think, goes into this same section of submit to the king, who is the ultimate authority over you. And, the same love the brotherhood, believers, fear God, honor the king, is that we need to find that spot where we are able to follow after God, but also be an example to other people, put up with our situation, frankly, I think is what he's saying there to the slaves. Even if you have, it says, slaves, submit to your masters with all respect, not only those who are good and considerate, but also those who are harsh. I think it's a hard calling to just be in the spot you're in sometimes and be content and be Christian and be loving and be responsive to authority and be respectful and honoring of authority. Yeah, I'm in a spot where I have a number of employees, and I hate to even, I can't tell you some of the things that have been said about me as an employer. And, almost all of them are things like somebody, misses 2 weeks of work and we say, well, you need a note for that. And suddenly I'm a scumbag. It's like, it's not a personal or a spiritual affront, but it's very easy to be attacked for things that are what we would all consider to be pretty straightforward. And I think it's very easy as free American humans to use that freedom of speech to overdo the negative on how we respond to people. If somebody cuts us off in traffic, well, they're an idiot. Or if they, if somebody, juts in front of you in the line to the self-checkout deal at Walmart, well, that scumbag just, cut me off. And it's kind of sad to me how often I think that's the response, rather than a loving response of, I am in my spot for a reason. I will exhibit, the love of God, the love of Christ to that person in a way that hopefully would be remarkably helpful to them. Verse 12, chapter 2, live such good lives among pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. And that gets into that issue where we want to truly love every soul. It doesn't matter that the background of that soul is created by God. And if we can get past the barrier of somebody being different, wrong, different, kind of a different origin, a different color, a different language, a different way that they got into that same store that we're in trying to buy merchandise, or, whatever those things are, if we can realize how minuscule that is compared to verse 23, chapter 2, when they hurled their insults at Jesus, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on a tree so that we might die of sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds, you've been healed. So I think that is obviously the amazing example of how I think almost anything, and probably I could just say, nothing will happen in your life. Almost anything is tolerable compared to what Jesus went through. I can't picture a time when we'll be beaten and have a crown of thorns put on us, be nailed on a cross, hung up in front of people to be observed in our agonizing death. I don't think that's going to happen. I could be wrong. I think that, weirder things maybe have happened in societies, but I think that if we have that perspective, it is incredible how we could respond as Christians as an example to our world around us. Let's go back to Romans 13, because I want to look at this in context too and see what we can glean from it. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read again Romans 13:1 onward. Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror over those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, he will commend you. For he is God's servant to do you good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also because of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give everyone what you owe him. If you owe him taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. Now, don't let this little break in the verses and the passage disturb you, but it says, then let no debt remain outstanding, except the continuing debt to love one another. For he who loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law. The commandments: do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet, and whatever other commandment there may be, are summed up in this one rule: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to its neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. And do this, understanding the present time, the hour has come for you to wake up from your slumber, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. The night is nearly over, the day is almost here. So let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us behave decently as in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. Rather, clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ. Do not think about how to gratify the desires of the sinful nature. Accept him whose faith is weak, without passing judgment on disputable matters, and etc. So I'll stop there for a minute. But notice in all this submission to authorities, and when Peter talked to the church, the churches in Asia Minor, and he talked about how, Christ did the sacrifice that we would need to do. We should just respect others. And then here we come down to, if you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, revenue. If respect, then respect. And I'll tell you, that's the hardest one for me personally. It's hard to respect some people, I think. If honor, then honor. Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. For he who loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law. So let's think about that from the standpoint of how we can react then with, it's easy with governing authorities, I think, to talk about how to react to them, because I think most of the time it is a matter of frustration or, we could do it better. Don't they see the point of, how this law affects this economy? Or maybe, in fact, how important we feel it is to have a strong economy over any other ethical issue. And that's a tough one for us, because we are independent Americans. We're taught to, pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. Is that the expression?
Yeah.
Okay. And then it sounded strange to me there. And, that you can fight your way to the top, you can achieve it, you can make it. And all those things, frankly, have been true in my life. I think I am incredibly blessed. I live in freedom. I have resources. I have family. I have food every day. I have enough excess food that I have pets and I feed them. I'm upset this week because my air conditioning's out and it's October and it really doesn't matter. But, we love those things because they are comforts for us. And we have amazingly peaceful, gentle lives in looking in perspective. I always find it interesting that when this was written, and I've mentioned for a couple of weeks now that this was written while Paul was being persecuted at times. He was threatened to be stoned at times. He was to be in prison. That he mentioned he wanted to go to Rome to visit, but he was ultimately only able to because he went as a prisoner. And he was imprisoned under the reign of Nero, under whom he was eventually killed. And Nero was a much worse leader than any leader we've ever figured out to put into office in America. And, you know, dramatically worse about the public nature, at least, of executions and persecution of the Christians. And in all of that, he's saying, love overcomes all, serve the authorities. If you owe them taxes, pay the taxes. If you owe them respect, give them the respect, because they are placed there by God. So the next question I'd have, and I'll ask it in a minute, go ahead with your comment on that.
Well, this chapter sounds to me like setting up citizen of God's kingdom within the subset of the national kingdom, and that you, wherever there's order and peace, that's a God thing anyway. So where that exists within the national kingdom, go along with all of that. Or when there's conflict between the national kingdom and God's kingdom, then the questions may come up and you'll see all the examples of how that was handled. But he's just, it feels to me like he's just setting up conflicts of how you live as a king, as a citizen
of your, yeah. So he's talking about how this is sort of a setup for how we live as a citizen of God's kingdom versus the actual physical kingdom in which we may live at the time. And I think that's true. And I think that is why when we read things like, he who loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law, there at chapter 13, verse 8. And verse 9, love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to its neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. I think it's interesting that all those things can occur in any national setup, right? There is no border to the love that God has for all souls. There's no border for the magnitude of the blood of Christ and its ability to save us because of his death, burial, and resurrection. And I think I am in Garland, Texas this morning because God had some plan for that. Frankly, I don't really know where else I'd be if I weren't here, because we don't know that kind of thing. But it's interesting to me that I can serve God here in Garland, Texas, like I could if I lived in, you know, Cincinnati, Ohio, or maybe more notably, like over in Prague, or maybe in South Africa, or any of those places in China. And the interesting thing to me, too, is when talking about serenity and peace and the love of God and being in the presence of God, that is always possible, to be there in the peace that passes all understanding with God's plan for you. I find that personally, when we get together to worship, I find there are very few people here angry at that moment. I think it happens, you know, sometimes people don't like the service or the lesson or whatever, and those things all, you know, come and go. But I think mostly when we're praying together, singing together, it's an amazing amount of peace among people who maybe don't even know each other, but they know that they know God together. And you know, that's what I think was largely missing when we had to go online with things. Was, you know, there was the message still, there was the prayer, the support, but it just wasn't that. Boy, I'm saying with people that you know, maybe you're visiting today, I've never met, and yet we can sing together in praise to God, and we can pray for our community, our relationship with our neighbors, our missionaries, our giving, our sacrifice on stewardship and such. And all those things come together because God is here. And I think it's when we ultimately discuss ethics and right decisions and what to do in the right spot in life, it is to realize God is here. No matter where you are, he is here, and therefore needs to be obeyed. We need to be in worship to him, and keeping in mind that the word for worship in the New Testament, primarily in the Greek language, was proskuneo, which means a leaning toward, a positional kissing toward is actually what it means. Kissing toward an individual. So if you think about breaking that phrase down, kissing is ordinarily a response of respect or emotion or love or compassion. And that if you kiss toward someone, like for instance, a king, if you walk in the room with the throne and you see him extend his ring and you kiss toward it, what you're saying physically in the emotional response and the physical response of it is, I am subservient to you. You are in charge over me. So if we do that toward God, we are acknowledging that we are always in response to his will for us. And I think that's what it boils down to also when we look at like verse 9, the commandments: do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet, and whatever other commandments there may be, they are summed up in this one rule: love your neighbor as yourself. I often have thought about how Jesus gave us essentially 2 commandments, and you can break that down into different, when he says, go and teach all the nations, that's certainly a commandment. But when he says, here are the 2 commandments, it was love God with all your heart, soul, mind, spirit, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And it is so much summed up in that love response. And I think that makes it different when we deal with what to do, ethically speaking. And we'll talk more about some specific ethics of everything from, warfare to abortion to imprisonment to whatever. I think those are all things we can consider as a Christian body. We'll talk about some of those next week. But I just want to leave the thought with you that if we just, from the consideration of what has God done for us in Jesus, and therefore what can we do for our fellow man, because God has done it all for us. He's created us, he's provided us salvation in Christ. He sent Jesus himself, as we read so eloquently mentioned, for instance, in Philippians 2 about Jesus himself didn't consider it a thing of his own, he was willing to come to earth, as I don't want to try to paraphrase and get out of context. He is willing to come save us, not considering being in heaven with God a thing that was more important than his desire to come and save us as the created souls of God. And when we view everyone else as an important soul before God, I think it's amazing how much we'll want to pray for them, teach them, feed them, care for them, just show concern, just show a loving spirit toward them. Some people never get that loving spirit to them. I am shocked that and I'm blessed to get to see a lot of people in my medical practice. It is shocking to me how many times people say, nobody else has ever been kind to me. And, I think that is just painful to see that. And we're talking about middle class, well-to-do enough to have a means to come to the doctor people, and they've never been cared for. So if we can care for others, I think it's of critical value. Thank you for all the comments. So we have ended on time, as long as you don't look at your watch. So thanks for being here.